So, in the year 1971, this man decided he wants to hijack a plane with a fake bomb and getting away with $200,000 in cash. And what makes this story really crazy is the fact that the FBI are still looking for him till this day. Now, I want you guys to keep your detective ears open and listen very carefully because this story is different to any other. This story has many different possibilities and theories which will probably keep you guessing all night. Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Drama, and today we're going to take a deep dive into the story of D.B. Cooper. Now, this story is actually really famous, so there's a high chance you've heard this story before, but I'm going to make this in a way where it's really interesting. And this story is genuinely one of my favorite and most mysterious stories, which is why I think I'll cover it today. So, it's November 24th, 1971, which makes it Thanksgiving Eve. I'd imagine everyone else is at home with their families, having a great time of their life, but not this guy in particular. We know him as Dan Cooper. Now, his real identity is very mysterious, and we'll get to that in a second. You guys gotta remember, this story was around 50 years ago. I mean, in the year 1971, airport security was different to how it is now. I mean, you could literally just walk into a flight and board on. I mean, for everyone else, it was just a 30-minute trip from Portland to Seattle. Nothing unusual, just a routine flight. While everyone else was boarding the flight, among them was a man, and he was dressed in a dark suit and shirt and tie. Dressed very appropriately, and all he had was a briefcase and his name, which is probably written on his ticket, and that's the only reason why they have the name Dan Cooper. So we don't actually know if that's his real name, but because back in the day they didn't have things like passport checks and ID verifications and visas, you could literally just have any name on your ticket and travel wherever you want on any flight. So for him, he just chose the name Dan Cooper, or perhaps it could have been his actual name. So for this story, we will be referring to him as Dan Cooper. But inside the cabin, Cooper blended in perfectly. He was calm, he was polite, so you wouldn't even notice a thing. He wasn't like a mysterious serial killer where he was acting all strange and angry. No, he was just a regular passenger. Perhaps he was even described as being very polite even throughout the whole hijacking. So he was sat in the flight and he ordered a bourbon and soda and lit a cigarette and sat quietly in the back row. And he saw one of the flight attendants walk past and handed her a note. Now, flight attendants in that time would probably get harassed a lot. So her thinking, oh, it's probably his phone number or he's trying to ask me out, looked at the note, smiled, and just put it in her pocket. She was nervous and she did not want to deal with it. She had no idea what was actually written on the note was something completely different. Dan Cooper handed her a note. And when he found out she wasn't even bothered to read it, he quickly tapped her again and said, you might want to read this note. So she opened the note, and in the note it said, I have a bomb, come and sit next to me. So this is when things get serious. He wanted her to let the crew know that there is a bomb on board, which we later do find out that it wasn't even a real bomb. But no one is going to have a clue at that time, because if you see a note saying you have a bomb, sorry, I forgot to point out, he did show her a bomb, which it looked like a bomb. It was just like strings and some red pellets. He basically made it seem like a bomb to the point where she believed him, because no one's going to take a chance when you're in a flight full of passengers. So she had to lay the information down to the pilots. But what did Dan Cooper actually request? What was his motive behind this whole hijacking? I mean, he didn't want to hurt anyone, that's for sure, because he was actually very polite and he had very specific demands. He ordered the pilot to get in 4 parachutes, $200,000 in cash. In today's money, that would be worth around $1.4 million. So he basically wanted to be a millionaire. And he also demanded that the money had to be in $20 bills. I'm not sure why he asked for $20 bills in specific, but he also made sure that there were 4 parachutes, 2 mains and 2 reserves, possibly trying to make the FBI think that he wants to take hostages with him so that they don't try and sabotage when the plane lands. He also demanded that the flight gets refueled and that they shouldn't try to play any tricks with him with the money, and he wanted everything to be ready by the time the plane landed. The passengers weren't even aware of the hijacking. No one was told, and everything seemed very calm in the cabin. And even the crew acted calm and they didn't want anyone to panic. So for everyone else, this was still a normal flight, but it was taking longer than usual because it wasn't just a 30-minute flight, because the plane had to circle around for ages and ages while the government tried to gather all the money from different banks. Think about it. They had to try and figure out a way to gather $200,000 in that time in less than 2 hours. Surprisingly enough, the government and the FBI actually complied, but in today's time, things would probably be a lot different. But here's what Dan Cooper's plan was. He instructed the pilot to head towards Mexico. But before that, they had to make the stop in Seattle for the refuel. See, the pilot convinced Dan Cooper that the plane does not have enough fuel to even go anywhere near Mexico, so the stop to Seattle was necessary, and it was kind of part of Cooper's plan because there is where the exchange happened. I don't know if this Dan Cooper was a genius, but what he does next is borderline genius, and it's probably the key to why he actually got away with it. Why don't the FBI just apprehend him there and then as soon as the plane lands? See, this is where Dan Cooper was really smart about it. He decided this is where the exchange happens, and he wanted to make sure there was no games being played. Now, keep in mind, to all the FBI know, he has a real bomb in that plane and there's a real threat. So what he does is he releases all 36 passengers. So this would be a green flag for the FBI to go inside and get him out of the plane and finally arrest him. See, he actually thought that through, which is why he asked for 4 parachutes. What he did is release all the passengers, but he left out the cabin crew and the pilots. So altogether, there was 4 people left in the plane. There was 2 pilots, 1 flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant, and Dan Cooper. So there was actually 5 people left in the plane and 4 parachutes. So things are getting a little risky for them. To make sure Dan Cooper did not get sniped throughout the interaction, he demanded that the cabin lights get closed and also the shades on the windows. You know, the shades that you have to go to sleep. So he demanded that everything gets closed off so they don't see at all what's going on inside the plane. And all the passengers get released in Seattle. So technically, the passengers did get to their destination and it's only the crew left. So the FBI get him over his demands, $200,000 in cash and the 4 parachutes, and the plane successfully takes off again at 7:30 p.m. After the second takeoff from Seattle, the plane was meant to head towards Mexico City. Dan Cooper had to make sure the plane flies in his conditions. So he ordered the pilots to make sure that the altitude of the flight stays exactly at 10,000 feet. And all of that is for a good reason. I'll explain in a second. And he also wanted to make sure that the speed was exactly at 200 miles an hour. That is the minimum speed that the flight can go without the plane stalling and crashing. So he wanted the flight to be at the minimum slowest speed. And he also demanded that the landing gear was down and the flaps were at 15 degrees. Strange request, but he also wanted the cabin to be depressurized. And that was so that the stairs could be opened from the back. So you can guess where this is going. The FBI probably realized that this guy was planning to jump from the back of the plane. Now, I also forget to mention at the start that this is the specific plane that has this option of a back stair, an open staircase at the back where it has the option where the stairs can be opened from the back of the plane. So every other flight at that time did not have that option. So DB Cooper actually thought this through when he planned it. He wasn't that stupid after all. Maybe he was an intern or worked with flights before, but he knew what he was doing and his demands were very, very specific. So the plane is flying at the specific altitude of 200 miles an hour with 10,000 feet, landing gears down. Halfway through the flight, Cooper then demanded that all the crew that are in the cabin and everyone on board to go straight to the cockpit. So everyone is locked in the cockpit room with the pilots while he has the whole cabin to himself because he did not want them to know what he was doing. He was planning on jumping and he had 2 of the parachutes with him. Now, this is why the story is mysterious and people thought that maybe he did not survive because when he jumped, he had 2 parachutes. One parachute was not working and the other parachute was a military parachute. Around 8 p.m. when it was heavily raining with strong winds, the stair door opens because in the cockpit they were able to see the alert about the stair door being open, and crew did feel a sudden pressure change and the plane's tail bounce, which kind of indicates that Cooper might have made that jump around that time. Somewhere over southwest Washington, likely near the Ariel, Washington area, Cooper jumps with the cash strapped to him and the parachutes. So he takes 2 parachutes with him. Now this is where the mystery starts because people start to suspect that maybe he didn't even survive the jump. I mean, think about it. We come to find out that Cooper wasn't even an experienced jumper and he was jumping in very rough conditions at very high altitudes with strong winds. It was very, very slim chances of him surviving, but the chances of him being dead are also slim because there was no body found. Now the only reason why people speculated that Dan Cooper might actually be dead is because of the fact that he had no experience in jumping. I mean, his choice of parachutes really showcased that he had little to no experience with jumping because he chose the worst options. I mean, one of the parachutes he chose wasn't even real. You see, when the FBI gathered parachutes for him, they had little to no time, so they just went to the nearest skydiving base, grabbed 4 chutes, and just decided to deliver it to him. But one of the chutes was actually not working and it was fake. It was sealed shut, so they couldn't even use the chute. And the other one was a military parachute. Now you might think, okay, the military parachute is the better option. I mean, they use it in the military, but actually it has a very big defect, which is the military parachutes actually are not steerable. And him jumping in the rough, windy conditions like I described in the middle of the forest, it really does not help his odds of surviving. I mean, I'm not saying it's completely impossible to survive, but with his experience, it's very unlikely. But the only issue is there was no body found, so that has not even been confirmed. Also, another thing that showcases that Dan didn't really think through the landing is the fact that he didn't even choose the flight route. See, when they were refueling, Dan Cooper was trying to rush the pilot. After Dan realized it was taking longer than usual to refuel, he thought maybe something was going up and got nervous, so he rushed the pilot. And a statement from the pilot saying that Dan Cooper told him just to get on with it. So the pilots weren't even given a specific flight route so Dan could know where to land. So Dan had no idea which route the flight was going and just went for it at a random time, which showcased that maybe Dan did not think this through. Now here's the fun part, and what really makes this story unique is because we all have a role to play. Since this story has not been confirmed, we all have to make our own deductions, and we're gonna dive into every single possibility so far, because in the past 50 odd years of this investigation, the FBI have come up with very different possible outcomes, and each have valid explanations, and I'm gonna try my best to deliver them all accurately, and I want you guys to really let me know what you think makes more sense. Now the first possible outcome is that he just died in the jump. I mean, the evidence for that would be that the jumping conditions and the heavy rain really affected the jump, and the location that he jumped in really did not help him survive, and there was freezing cold winds and it was pitch dark, and the flight speed for the jump was 200 miles per hour. So imagine the plane moving at 200 miles per hour and he has to just jump from the back with all these rough conditions. And also there was no night vision, he had no special equipment, he was just wearing regular clothes, and there was a dense forest and rivers, and it's very easy to get lost or drown, so it's gonna be hard to even find the body for them, let alone make your way out of it. And also there was no confirmed sightings of parachutes ever found, which makes people think that okay, there is a possibility that Dan Cooper just died in the jump and didn't even survive. And the evidence against that would be that they did find evidence of the money that he stole in 1980, which is like 9 to 10 years later, and they found it really far away near the Columbia River. It suggests that at least some of the cash made it outside his body. See, the money was confirmed to be the exact same that Dan Cooper demanded 10 years ago because it matched the serial number. Now the weird thing is the fact that the money had its rubber band still intact and in the stacks of 2, and they were buried under the sand. And some people did speculate that Dan Cooper buried them himself, because they were all wondering how the hell did the money get so far out of the landing zone. See, when the FBI did their investigation, they realized that the area that Dan Cooper was suspected to have jumped out of and the area where the money was found was very far apart. And this didn't even make the investigation easier, it just made them ask more and more questions of how did the money get here. This is why they started to speculate that him dying is actually a very low probability, because the money being buried so far away suggests that somebody has put it there. Now let's look at the other possible theories. How come he is not cool? Now we gotta look at the motive of why he would steal £200,000 of money. Other than just having the money, he did suggest that he had a grudge, not against the airline specifically, but he did state that during the flight and during the interaction, I have a grudge, maybe not against this airline, but maybe against flying in general. So he did have some sort of motive that led him to do this heist. And what makes Dan Cooper really crazy is for me that the fact that he was so calm and collected and unnoticeable throughout the whole occasion, and the fact that people still suspect till this day who he is. He did not leave any traces of DNA or any fingerprints to match his personality or his person, and that till that day he has not been caught. Now of course the crime did happen in the 1970s. At that time it was probably a lot easier to get away with things as there wasn't modern technology and cameras and all these things that would have safety measures, but it's still insane to me that he did it. Now keep in mind, after this infamous hijacking from Dan Cooper, a lot of people tried to hijack planes after it, demanding the same stuff. I mean, people saw on the news that the fact that this guy called Dan Cooper just hopped on a plane, demanded 200,000. So you can imagine there was a lot of wannabes, but they didn't have the same experience and they all kept getting caught. There was around another 14 attempts in the same couple of years of people trying to hijack planes, but all of them getting caught within 2 or 3 days, and some even getting caught on the plane itself. But this person in particular did manage to get away for a few days and did eventually get caught, but his style made the FBI think that he is a potential suspect. Now his name is Richard Floyd McCoy. He had a very strong military background. He was a veteran helicopter pilot and a skilled skydiver. He was known for being calm under pressure and having military training. Now the reason why they suspected that he might have been Dan Cooper himself is because he did the hijacking in the exact same style. I mean, in April 1972, just months after the Cooper hijacking, McCoy hijacked a United Airlines Boeing 727, exactly the same style plane that Cooper did, and he demanded $500,000 in ransom money and parachutes. So this time he got a little bit more greedy. Escaped by parachuting from the rear stairs, almost identical to Cooper's method. Imagine that not all the files were classified and not everything was made mainstream in the case of Dan Cooper, but they realized that this guy, Richard Floyd McCoy, escaped in the same way as Dan Cooper. So evidence for him being Dan Cooper is the fact that he had the same plane model, same hijacking style, and the same escape method. And he also had military and parachuting skills to match what Cooper seemed to know, because Cooper chose the military parachute and the suspect Richard Floyd McCoy actually had military experience, so the FBI suspected that he could have been Dan Cooper. Now the evidence against him is that the witnesses in the flight said that Cooper looked older. McCoy was like 29 at the time, where Cooper was meant to be in his mid-40s. The physical description didn't actually match and the FBI ruled him out, though many believed that he was the best candidate. Either way, Richard Floyd McCoy was caught, he was sentenced to jail, escaped in 1974 and killed in a shootout with the FBI. Criminal or not, let's be respectful and say RIP Richard Floyd. If you were Dan Cooper, then you were kind of cool. But the next potential suspect, his name was Dwayne Weber. Now he's an interesting person because he actually had criminal background, which is why the FBI potentially had him as a suspect. He did die also in 1995, but on his deathbed, allegedly he did tell his wife, "Listen, I'm Dan Cooper," which is kind of weird to hear as his wife. You can just imagine on your husband's deathbed, he just randomly comes out with saying he's Dan Cooper. His widow claimed that he had nightmares about leaving fingerprints on a plane, which probably could explain why he's got trauma from his incident. She also said that he once took her to Columbia River, and this is exactly the spot where the money was found. And she said this is where Cooper hid the money. Now, it matched with the FBI's data where they found the money matching the serial numbers where the money was buried, around $5,800 of it. The evidence for him being the suspect is the fact that he confessed on his deathbed and he had alleged knowledge of case details that was not public at the time. But there was also evidence against him being Dan Cooper, which is the fact that there was no physical evidence tied to him to the hijacking. I mean, they didn't find any matching DNA or fingerprints, but that could also be ruled out as they didn't even know whose fingerprints were on the plane or the things that have been found that belonged to Dan Cooper. The fingerprints didn't match, and some details might have been invented or misremembered by his wife, because you gotta remember his wife must have been old and freaky at the time, so she probably did not remember everything by detail, and you can't just call him the suspect due to a confession, because maybe he had dementia or some wild dreams, or maybe he's just making false claims before he dies. But either way, he is a potential suspect, but for me, I'd say the odds are quite low. I mean, he's just an old man, he confessed on his deathbed, and he could just be making false statements. Now, the third suspect goes by Kenneth Christiansen. Now, this guy had a promising background. I mean, he was a World War II paratrooper, and he worked as a flight attendant and later a mechanic for Northwest Airlines. Now, his background ties a lot more to Dan Cooper's character, because he did have a lot of knowledge of the Boeing 727 planes, the same plane that was hijacked. And he did know a lot about the Northwest flight operations. And shortly after the hijacking, he did buy a house and property with cash, despite not having much money before. So he just suddenly had lots of money and managed to buy a house after the hijacking. This is what kind of made things seem suspicious. Also, his brother later suspected him and pushed the case publicly. I mean, I don't know why his own brother would rat him out like that, but this is why the FBI potentially had him as a suspect. The evidence for him being Dan Cooper is his aviation experience, and his paratrooping background just fits just like Dan Cooper's. And also, he worked for the same airline Cooper hijacked. Things with hijackings, you gotta have experience with the airline industry to know exactly what you're doing. So this is why they had Kenneth as a suspect. But there was also evidence against him being a suspect because witnesses and crew did not think he looked like Cooper at all. He was shorter and bolder than the description given. And at the end, he did die in 1994, and FBI reviewed him as a suspect but found no solid evidence. Another untied string. Now, the last and most promising suspect by the name of Robert Rackstraw. Now, there were a lot more other suspects involved, but these are the main four that had the highest probability and the highest suspicion. Now, Robert had an ex-army paratrooping and pilot experience, and he did have a criminal past. He was caught before with fraud and explosive charges and fake IDs, which kind of ties to what Cooper did in the hijacking. He could have been using fake IDs and fake explosives. His connection to Cooper was being skilled in parachuting, explosives, and aviation. And also, when he was questioned in the late 1970s, he even hinted to the reporters that he could be Cooper. When they questioned him in the court about "Are you Cooper?" he did not deny and laughed it off after. He wasn't even taking them serious. Amateur investigators linked his military background and fake IDs to Cooper's careful planning. When they looked at the way Cooper planned his hijack and the way this Robert person had experience in the same field, they did suspect that he is the most highest potential suspect when it comes to being Dan Cooper. And the evidence for him is he had the skills, the pilot, paratrooping, and explosive skills, and also he physically resembled the FBI sketches. When they were investigating and they got witness reports, they did a sketch of Dan Cooper, which is shown over here, and he physically resembled his face. And also, he did have ties to forged documents and secretive behavior, which even raised their suspicions more. Now, Robert's case was eventually dismissed because the FBI said there wasn't enough evidence to even pursue him seriously. His case was dismissed in 1979 as a suspect, and he just lived a quiet life until he died in 2019, which is not that long ago, and some still believe he was Cooper. I mean, for me, I'd say he's the most potential suspect when it comes to his behavior and him living a quiet life, because Cooper seemed like a quiet person who didn't want any of this drama. Now, other suspects worth mentioning is Lynn Doyle Cooper, LD Cooper. Now, LD Cooper was a Korean War veteran. He worked as a logger and mechanist in Origin, and he didn't really have the normal character. I mean, he was known to be very unstable and erratic. Now, his little niece made a surprising claim. His niece Marla Cooper claimed that on Thanksgiving in 1971, the exact day after the hijacking, she saw her uncle LD Cooper come back home injured and bloody, and she said her family has been preparing for something big just before the hijacking. And he was also a fan of Dan Cooper comic books. Now, what made him a suspect is the fact that he had the comic book connection to Dan Cooper, and also his family's testimony about injuries after the hijacking. Him coming back home all blooded and injured could be that he just came back from landing from a plane after a crazy hijacking. Also, that he lived in the Pacific Northwest and he knew the area very, very well. So if he did survive, then there is a potential that could have been him. The evidence against him being Dan Cooper is that the testimony came decades later and based on memories of a child at the time. I mean, she was a little girl at the time, and there was no physical evidence linking him to the case. So the FBI didn't really find enough proof to put him as the serious suspect, so they didn't even question him that much. Another suspect worth mentioning is William J. Smith. He was also a Navy veteran and he worked in the railroad, so he knew around the railway, which if he was Dan Cooper, it would have helped him escape and get out of the area. Also, William did have a motive because in the 1950s, he did lose a friend in a train accident and he blamed the corporate greed and company's greed for the accident. I don't know exactly what happened in that accident. He had a grudge against corporate companies and their money and greed. So he had a grudge against them. And he also had very high knowledge of the railroads and logistics of the city, which maybe helped him plan an escape. Evidence for him being Dan Cooper is his strong military background, discipline, and survival skills. He also had very close physical resemblance to Cooper's sketches, and he also had a motive to hijack these corporate planes. The evidence against him is that the fact that he lived on the East Coast, which is far away from the hijacking, and he also had no direct evidence placing him on the flight at that time. His motive isn't directly linked to the hijacking because there wasn't even any confession or family links made to the hijacking, so this keeps him away from being a potential suspect. Now, the last potential suspect I'll be mentioning today is Sheridan Peterson, who suspiciously enough worked for Boeing. He was an employee in the 1960s. So he knew the aircraft very well, and he was a skilled jumper. I mean, he knew how to parachute into forests and fires and everything. He was also described as very adventurous, which kind of matches Dan Cooper's adventurous kind of behavior, and he did have connection to the hijacking. He had knowledge of Boeing 727s, the exact model that was hijacked, and he lived a lifestyle of risk-taking and fitting Cooper's profile. The evidence for him being Cooper is he had Boeing connections, so he had very well knowledge of the plane and the exact models, deeper knowledge of the plane's rear stair mechanisms as well. He also had parachuting skills. It kind of fits the skills that Dan Cooper had. Similar to all the other suspects, they are just finding people that match his skills, but for me, I'd say it's more about the character and the motive. Now, the cons of him being not Dan Cooper is the fact that he himself denied all the allegations of being Cooper, and the FBI investigated him and they didn't find any solid evidence. And he also lived abroad around the time of the hijacking, which complicated the timeline, so he didn't even fit the timeline of the hijacking as he lived abroad. But nevertheless, all these suspects that I mentioned all have their own stories, own versions, and own little gaps. So this is why I find this story very interesting, is the fact that there's so many potentials, and at the end, Dan Cooper could have just died in the jump. But there's always missing pieces. I mean, the fact that they found the cash 10 years later buried somewhere, and the fact that so many people came out and confessed and so many people gave in evidence, yet no one confirmed a thing, and the FBI closed the case in 2016 and left it at where it was. So Dan Cooper could very well be alive and watching this right now, and we would never know. But I also want you guys to let me know if I've missed something, because this is my first time narrating such a deep and hard story. I know I'm probably struggling a bit. I'm trying to get you all the accurate information and also trying to make this interesting for you guys. And I also want to hear your opinions. Do you think Dan Cooper survived? Do you think any of these guys was Dan Cooper? Or do you think he's just living a quiet life somewhere while being a millionaire laughing? Either way, if you guys enjoyed this, make sure you subscribe to Dr. Drama, as I'm trying to cover as many stories for you as I can for you, and making them in an entertaining way where you can watch these and relax. And that concludes the unsolved mystery of the DB Cooper case. And I really enjoyed going through this, and hopefully we'll catch you in another adventure. Good night.